for example, would you consider schizophrenia to be innate or external?
Oh, that's a really interesting one because I know that there's research that's been done on cultures that are less, that bin people less, where it's like the, I don't want to misrepresent this, but if I remember correctly, it's basically like cultures where mental illness is seen as something that can be integrated into the community, where, say, there's sufficiently strong social ties. Somebody who's schizophrenic isn't binned as being schizophrenic, it's just that they're in touch with something that is not what everybody else is in touch with, and it's kind of accepted and folded into it. And so you in that in that space I can imagine a circumstance where you experience something and you lean into it and it's all right, versus a situation where you experience something and you lean into it and the society as a whole is structured to alienate and ostracize and abandon you. And that would create a difference in the manifestation of it, whether or not it's innate. Does that make sense?
Like
I
it's
would agree.
seeded. Oh, I'm sorry.
Um,
I was just gonna say it sounds like what you're saying is it was seeded maybe innately, but the way that it's expressed and manifested in this thing we call schizophrenia is very external or something like
Yeah,
that.
like there's like, let's say that there's a propensity. The propensity is then manifest externally in how it's framed and how it's perceived. And let's say that you have a personality that is more likely to reject or to rebel against somebody who treats you poorly. Like, let's say you have schizophrenic tendencies and everybody treats you like you're crazy. And maybe you're the type of personality who, because everybody's treating you like you're crazy, you get angry and you get frustrated and you get annoyed and you lean into it more. And so it manifests the way that it does in our society rather than how it would elsewhere.
hmm. Haven't they done studies, or say this generically? I feel like I have the fact lodged in my head that people in other cultures, sometimes when they're schizophrenic, they hear like nice voices instead of angry voices. You know, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and like I think I remember there being a study that showed that after the 40s, when aliens like visitation became a thing, that more schizophrenics started to have alien visitation narratives. And so it's definitely something, the voice that you hear inside of your head is a product of the society. So I feel like it's honestly, maybe I'm like telling on myself, but I feel like it's a voice that I can recognize in myself sometimes. And I have enough of a distance from it where I'm like, yeah, my cell phone probably is listening to me, but I'm not going to like form my entire identity around that because I have other things that I want to do that allow me to kind of keep that in my periphery and focus on something else. But somebody who doesn't have something else and focuses iteratively on that, like how
Mm.
much of that is of their own creation, I don't know.
Mm. Interestingly, I suspect that schizophrenia is actually, like, relatively speaking, one of the least impacted by society things. I'm not saying it isn't at all, but like, for example, in my data, I asked, where are you on the political spectrum, and do you report having any of these mental illnesses? And there was a big list, and almost all of them were like significantly skewed towards like the left side of the political spectrum, which it seems like, of course, not like if the mental illnesses are some sort of like a physical trait, like unmalleable, we would expect to see an even distribution. And so my guess is that like illnesses that are more the more an illness is sort of like created and influenced by culture, the more we would expect to see it influenced by like where you are in the political spectrum, or other things like related to personality, roughly. And schizophrenia was one of the most in the middle ones. Like all of them were super shifted to the left, but schizophrenia was like almost exactly represented by both right and left. As one example. Another example is like I looked at the mental illness gap between cis and trans people, and females specifically. Um, and I would expect to be like, all right, like which mental illnesses do you think are overrepresented in trans people due to the way the society treats them? Like, shame and suppression and all of this stuff. Like I would, do you want to like have a guess at which ones?
Anxiety, probably
Mm-hmm.
depression.
Yeah. That was also my guess. Like probably ones that have to do with like being like unhappy in your own mind to some degree. Um, and they were elevated, but the most elevated ones by far were autism and schizophrenia. which are like, which I could see like maybe this is caused by society to some degree, but like not at several times the rate of like anxiety and depression. Like there's clearly some other sort of brain thing going on. So when it comes to actually schizophrenia specifically, and like slightly to a smaller degree autism, my guess is this is actually pretty independent relatively to other mental illnesses, which is I think why I asked about that one specifically.
I wonder though if other factors, social factors, like what about socioeconomic status with schizophrenia? Or I have it lodged in my brain too that more tribal cultures experience less incidents of schizophrenia. I wanted to Google that. Maybe you can check it out, Nastia. But I wonder if it's just some factor that hasn't been uncovered. But I also hear what you're saying though, that things that there's certain things that appear obvious on the surface that might actually be influenced by the present modern landscape more than others.
Yeah, I'm not saying that schizophrenia is completely independent. I'm just saying that like if we have a spectrum of how influenced by society, like some things clearly are brain, like you can punch somebody in the head and then they get a concussion, and this is not like a culturally induced issue. This is clearly like, oh, your neurons are firing right. Like clearly there is some sort of thing where just your neurons don't fire right, and it's like a little bit hard to disentangle. So my guess is that there's in fact a spectrum.
Well, so I'm looking up the schizophrenia stuff, but something that you said about the correlation of diagnosed mental illnesses along the political spectrum seems to be a readout of people's relationship to therapy and to mental illness in general, right? Like that seems like the most obvious thing, because I know plenty of people that are on the right that are like, therapists are stupid. This is like a waste of time. It's just, you navel gazing that perpetuates self-pity or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And that type of person would be deeply resistant to being diagnosed in any way, shape, or form. But there's a tendency that goes along with, I think, a left-leaning political identification that places much more value on this kind of introspective, internal work that by its very nature forces you to be diagnosed. Because I think that people go to talk therapy and they have this feeling that what they're doing is they're just talking to someone, but that person is also diagnosing. That person is like, there's worksheets that people do when they go to therapy, and those worksheets are ways that they're binning you into a category of what it is that you have, and then the treatment modality downstream of that is going to be reflected by what disorder they think that you have, because you can't treat somebody if you can't identify what it is that's wrong with them. And so I think it was like Jean Twenge, or Twenge, I don't know how to pronounce it. She does a lot of work on the prevalence of mental illness. And she posted this graphic where, all of these different mental illnesses had increased by, 10,000% since 1990. And I'm like, I don't think that that's an objective temperature of the world. I think that is what you're getting is a readout of diagnosis and the integration of therapy and therapy speak into society. And that's not a lens that she's looking at it from, because that's what she does. She's a therapist. And so it's really hard to step outside of that box to be like, okay, well, is the measurement the thing that is creating the thing in the first place? Like if we stopped measuring it, would it go down? Obviously it would.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's just this like, whenever you start talking about mental illness, I feel like you can't talk about it without talking about what the diagnosis is doing.
Yeah, I think this is probably a big part of the reason why the left is reporting higher rates of mental illness. It's not necessarily because they have more, but because it is the kind of culture where you're supposed to like go to therapy and then report your mental illnesses. It's just interesting that this effect is not applying to schizophrenia.